From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. 9 days until a potential X date, as outlined by Treasury Secretary Yellen, and both sides still far apart, according to their aides. But Speaker McCarthy today says he thinks they will make it.
We could still finish this by June 1st in a timeline. 97 days the president didn't want to meet. So, I mean, we're trying to condense everything in a short time frame. The House passed a bill and the Senate never passed one. So now it's more difficult. What else do you have to negotiate with? From a lot of different perspectives. But we can still finish in time.
Plus, at the Qatar Economic Forum, Hungary's leader, Viktor Orban, says Ukraine can't win the war against Russia. We'll hear what former Defense Secretary William Cohen has to say about that.
And they say politics makes strange bedfellows. Well, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis now reportedly set to make his 2024 announcement tomorrow on Twitter Spaces with, yes, Elon Musk. Kaylee, it's another day of interesting headlines. We didn't expect that one, but we'll be talking about that a lot more over the course of the broadcast and, of course, tomorrow. Today, we're still gnawing on a potential debt ceiling deal, and it's hard to tell if we're closer than we were last night.
Yeah, it really is. We were just hearing from Congressman Garrett Graves, who, of course, is one of those in the GOP negotiating on Speaker McCarthy's behalf, who said they don't have any additional meetings set up. Unclear exactly what that means. He went on to say there are some areas where they are very close. I think we'd all like to know exactly what those areas are.
Yeah, I'd love to know. It was right at this time yesterday, of course, we were waiting for this meeting to get started at the White House. Since then, we've heard quite a bit of talking from both sides, not many specifics. One thing we can say, though, is for Republicans, they are definitely on message. Listen.
The Speaker knows that we're in lockstep behind him right now.
The lack of urgency here is apparent from the negotiating stance of the White House.
President Biden hasn't taken this seriously. He took almost 100 days off. The president, while criticizing the only plan that's passed, hasn't put anything on the table serious himself.
We're 9 days out from the Biden administration's default deadline. Whatever default Joe Biden is threatening is on Joe Biden.
And some new talking points that we heard there today. Tom Emmer there referring to Joe Biden's default deadline. That's a new one, Kaylee, as they try to shift the blame around before anything even happens.
Yeah, and a lot of questions around the timeline that the Treasury has laid out and whether that as early as June 1st really should be the deadline they are looking for. Of course, we also heard from the House Financial Services Chairman Patrick McHenry, who is also another negotiator around the table, suggesting that the White House isn't displaying much urgency on this matter. That is something that Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, took issue with earlier today.
This is urgent, but this is not political. This is about doing the work of and the business of the American people. This is something that we have said over and over again for the past 5 months, that this is for Congress to act. This is their constitutional duty. We think Republicans saying that the White House is not showing any urgency is a ridiculous question, is a ridiculous statement for them to be making.
All right, so let's go around the table now. Joining us are Bloomberg's Washington Deputy Managing Editor, Wendy Benjaminson, and Bloomberg's Executive Editor for Government, Mike Shepard. So, Mike, if you could just help us understand where exactly we are. We know that negotiators from the White House were at the Capitol today. They then left. We've had a lot of gaggles between McCarthy and McHenry and Graves today. So it is 5:04 p.m. Where do we stand right now?
Well, we've had quite a few days, and we have seen us go from so-so, which you heard yourself, Kaylee, from the Speaker on Saturday, to productive from the Speaker on Monday, to today. He doesn't think they can get anything done tonight. But that doesn't mean they can't get it done at all this week. One of the other negotiators said as they were leaving this afternoon, I think it was Garrett Graves himself, said that they believe they have ironed out most of the differences and locked down most of the key areas. The one that they seem to be stuck on, however, is spending, the spending caps, where they decide to set spending, whether it's 2023 or 2024 levels, and how long they decide to keep these caps in place. Those seem to be the two key issues. Once they lock that down, the rest of the deal seems to be falling into place more quickly. One of the new layers in the narrative today is questioning the X date. As we all woke up to a story this morning in Washington suggesting the Treasury Department sent a memo to agencies asking if they have any flexibility with making some payments. This is how it came out on the other end from Republican Congressman Steve Scalise. Listen.
We'd like to see more transparency on how they come to that date, but Janet Yellen herself actually left the door open to delaying that in her tweets yesterday. The comments that she sent out yesterday implied that it's June 1st or later, giving some openness to the idea that June 1st may not be the so-called X date. So, haven't really been able to see a lot of transparency, but it looks like they're hedging now and opening up the door to move that date back.
Not that the Treasury said that they're opening the door. What is going on here, Wendy, if it's just a test of the Treasury's credibility?
I think this reflects the pressure they're all getting from Donald Trump and from the Freedom Caucus to say, don't believe not only the Treasury Department, but Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan have all come out and said it's around the first 2 weeks of June where the government will run out of money. So you have private and public sector economists saying it is going to be this, and Donald Trump saying, default, just default if you don't get anything you want. And so the Freedom Caucus members, like Representative Scalise, are sort of having Donald Trump in one ear and the facts that they're getting from Yellen and others in the other, and they need to.
Is this the way to crack the door on prioritization? Because we've heard these proposals before. Just pay off the bondholders and let the agencies suffer. It's actually not technically a default. Is that what he's saying?
I think that would be a really last-ditch effort for them to do a technical default, because it still affects the credit ratings. It's still a very bad political move right before this contested presidential election. So I think that, a short-term deal, all the other little things that they're thinking about are things they really dread because of the political impact.
And yet, I wonder, Mike, ultimately, if we're going to have to see the short-term deal just because of the clock. I mean, the X date is one thing, whatever it may be, whenever in early June it may be. When we are talking about a deal that still needs to be reached, then turned into legislative text, and then sit in the House for 72 hours because McCarthy says he's going to stick with that rule to allow members that time before voting on it. I mean, we are talking days from conversion from agreement in principle to law.
What that might mean is that they might have to cut a few corners on the 72 hours, even though they say they won't. As time gets more squeezed, they may have to do a few things, including work through the weekend, which they may be here even though it's a holiday. No barbecues, or if they have barbecues, it may be up on Capitol Hill. And I think, Joe, back to your point about and to Wendy's point on the pressure that they are both trying to apply by questioning the Treasury Department's analysis and the pressure from Donald Trump. They are really trying to apply pressure on Kevin McCarthy to hold firm and to hold the line in the negotiations. They do not want him to cede any ground when it comes to the spending cuts that they want to see as part of any deal. Let's talk about the pressure on Joe Biden here for a moment as we look at both of the principles. Pressure from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in the House. I spoke today with Jim McGovern, Congressman from Massachusetts, who's ranking member on the Rules Committee. His passion issue is beating the hunger crisis. Here's what he had to say about additional work requirements on food stamps and other social programs. He spoke with us on Bloomberg Sound On.
Look, I'm sick and tired of trying to deal with our budgetary challenges by screwing poor people, and that's what this is about. There are already work requirements as part of the SNAP program for able-bodied adults without dependents. Those who are not fulfilling those work requirements are people graduating out of foster care, veterans, people with undiagnosed mental illnesses. I mean, do we really want to take food away from these individuals?
Obviously, you're hearing from a progressive there, but he could bring a lot more votes with him. Does Joe Biden stand to lose the progressive caucus if that ends up in the final package? Because he said he's a no vote if that's in there.
Well, just as Mike said, he's under tremendous pressure from the left, just as McCarthy is under this equal pressure from the right. And so you have the Progressive Caucus who wants Biden to hold firm. Right. But Biden also sees the same. There was a Marist poll out today that said that a plurality of Americans will blame him, about 45%, and another plurality, about 43%, will blame congressional Republicans. So it's about a 50-50 chance that he's going to take the brunt of the blame for this.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't, and if he, as we've learned from previous elections, the progressive left will not hold the party line. Just because someone has a D by their name doesn't mean they're going to support them.
Right. Well, and as you say, elections, we have to keep in mind the president negotiating this is also running for re-election in 2024, and he's not alone. We know that already there has been several Republican candidates to officially toss their hat in the ring. Tomorrow, another's going to join them, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and his method of doing so, a Twitter Spaces with Elon Musk. Mike, can you just help me figure out how that is strategically advantageous to the Florida governor?
Well, I was hoping you might be able to help me figure it out, panel. Look, he is trying to capitalize on Twitter, and this is the platform that Donald Trump rode to election in 2016, but has since broken from and is in a way open ground politically, and he is hoping that by allying himself with Elon Musk, who now owns and runs Twitter, will be a springboard to him overtaking Trump in the race for the GOP nomination. His challenge right now is that he has a lot of ground to make up to with the former president in the competition for the nomination.
I also have to wonder how much this has to do with showing up with one of the world's richest people to show off in front of a man who's rather sensitive about his net worth. But we'll hear what they have to say tomorrow. Wendy Benjaminson and Mike Shepard, great conversation. Thanks for getting us started. Coming up, we're going to hear from Representative French Hill of Arkansas, a key ally of Speaker McCarthy in the throes of this negotiation. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for joining us as we get back to the latest here on the debt ceiling negotiations happening as we speak. Joining us, Congressman French Hill, Republican from Arkansas and Vice Chair of the House Financial Services Committee. It's good to see you, Congressman. Welcome back. I'm going to start wide open on this one. If we can just speak between the two of us here for a moment. Let's pretend no one's listening, because there's a lot of bluster and a lot of noise out there, as you know, on both sides of the aisle here. Where do we stand as we count down potentially 9 days to the X date? Do you feel like we're close to a deal?
Well, I think the important thing, Joe, is the fact that both sides are talking and talking earnestly. What's really frustrated me over the last few days is we lost the weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, as President Biden was coming back from the G7 meeting. And I don't think his negotiators got the memo about what the parameters of this negotiation are about. House Republicans want to cap the growth of domestic spending, get back to normal, go back to pre-pandemic priorities, and get spending under control, and then unleash our economy by having a deregulatory approach. These are our objectives, and that's what the president and Kevin McCarthy have agreed to talk about.
Yeah, and of course there was a weekend loss, but that was after that on the Republican side, negotiators walked out of the meeting saying that the White House is being unreasonable. Wherever the clock stands now though, after the weekend is over, it is Tuesday, May 23rd. We are in theory 9 days away from what Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has outlined as the earliest possible date that the government can no longer fulfill its obligations. And there has been an ongoing conversation about how believable the Treasury is when it says that. Last week, I was speaking with Senator Mike Rounds about that, and here's what he said.
There's a question as to whether June 1st is actually the date or if it's closer to perhaps the middle of the month. And if it is, then you've got your quarterly estimated reports coming in for cash flow. And if that's the case, this may very well go into July. So, yeah, I don't think the June 1st date is as solid as the Secretary had suggested to begin with.
And of course, Congressman, that was echoed in some way by the House Majority Leader Steve Scalise earlier today, talking about the transparency of how the Treasury gets to a date like that. Do you buy June 1? Should we be considering that a deadline?
Well, look, Kayleigh, we were ready on February 1. We've tried to get this done for 100 days, have a bipartisan, sensible, responsible way of raising the debt ceiling and curtailing the unbelievable amount of spending growth we've had over the past 2 years and the pandemic. So we've been ready since February, and we're the only group of people who have passed a plan to raise the debt ceiling, and that's under the leadership of Speaker McCarthy. It's Janet Yellen who sets that date, but you're right. Look, Moody's says it's not June 1st. It's not Republicans on the Hill. We're following Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary's direction. We're negotiating. We're using that date as the date. But you've had her wobble on that date in the last few hours, and you've had Moody's say it's a different date. So I get your point, but I think it's irrelevant. I think what we need to be doing is have the two sides come together and have a bipartisan agreement that we've waited for 100 days, and let's get this behind us.
Do you think, though, there is time to get a deal by June 1st, in theory?
I do. I think I do. I think we've got the right people negotiating this. Let's reach a conclusion, and let's turn that into legislative language. But I think it's important for people to recognize this is a deal that Joe Biden has to think is acceptable, Kevin McCarthy has to think is acceptable, and then we need some certainty that Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer believe they can get 60 votes for it in the Senate, and that will give us confidence, I think, to move it through the House.
Congressman, we heard earlier today from Representative Graves, who's helping, of course, to negotiate this deal. He said there are some areas where we are very close. Do you know what they are?
No, I won't preempt the good negotiators' work. That's not the job you and I have. I think what we need to be doing is communicating to the American people that Republicans and Democrats, no one wants to default on the Treasury securities. No one's proposing to do that. But unfortunately, Congress uses a deadline. And so like John Boehner told us years and years ago, Congress moves very slowly until it doesn't. And so we're working on this deadline, and we want to get a deal that's responsible and sensible, raises the debt ceiling, but curtails the avalanche of spending. You know, government spending is up 40% from 2 years ago. And the American people routinely tell us in polling they want spending controls, spending reductions as a part of this package.
What spending controls do you need to see in the ultimate deal, Congressman, to support it? What do you think the rest of your colleagues in the House will need to see?
Yeah, good question. Well, I would go back to the bill that we passed, which begins the baseline that we want to have FY 2022 spending levels. That is that we're not going to spend more money this year than we did last year. And remember, that's just 5 months ago. This is not some draconian baseline change. To say that is just purely political spin. And then we'd like to see a cap, and we've proposed 1% growth in domestic spending for the next 10 years. Those are two key components. We put them in our bill. I think that's something that a lot of people support, including some Democrats who know that our spending has just grown out of proportion when we're projecting $1.5 trillion deficits per year the next 10 years.
But of course, if you did go back to FY22 levels, Congressman, and I know we've talked about this before, you've got the Pentagon off the table, Social Security, Medicare all off the table. So doesn't that require much more intense cuts in a smaller portion of the pie, just a fewer number of programs here?
Well, you're right. I mean, this would be, we would use that debt ceiling total number, that cap, how much we would raise it over the next fiscal year, and then we would go through the normal appropriations bill process, something that's completely forgotten in this back and forth. And we would write the appropriations bills for every aspect of government, defense and non-defense. And you're right, we would pick and choose under that new cap based on the debt ceiling increase as to how we recommend, we House Republicans recommend, and that has to pass the Senate, and that has to be signed into law by President Biden.
And the clock is ticking. Congressman French Hill, Republican from Arkansas, thank you so much, as always, for your time. We really appreciate it. And coming up, Republicans are pressuring Democrats, as we were just discussing, to cut spending to reach a debt ceiling deal. But what might that cost the country from an economic standpoint? Could we lose more than 500,000 jobs? That's the analysis by Bloomberg Economics. We'll have more on that next on Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. If the Republican Party's spending cuts make it through the legislative gauntlet, it could mean an additional 570,000 job losses relative to a clean debt limit increase. That's according to a new Bloomberg economics analysis. And joining us now to discuss is the author of that report, Bloomberg's chief economist, Anna Wong. So, Anna, that is in the extreme scenario you looked at. You lay out a couple of them, but just walk us through how you get to a figure like that.
Right. So, we take a look at three scenarios. One is the original House Speaker McCarthy plan, which went through the House a month ago. And that is what this 570,000 job losses estimate came from. So what we do is we look at the plan carefully and we plug that into our model that takes into, which is a dynamic model that takes into account, when you have spending cuts like that, GDP is going to contract, and also what that would do with a multiplier. For every dollar that the government reduced spending, economists have an estimate of how that multiply through the economy, right? So especially in times of recession and a period of high inflation where the Fed cannot cut interest rate as they normally would in a circumstance of downturn. When they can't do that, it means that any kind of contraction in spending would propel into the multiply in the economy in a more, bigger way than during normal times.
A lot of this has to do with timeline, of course. And by the way, congratulations. I'm guessing you spent more time with the, Limit, Save, Grow bill than anyone in Washington. What if Joe Biden got a 2-year deal? If we start to look at different versions of this, let's say the cuts were more modest. Do you have, in a dynamic model, an answer for that too?
Yeah, so our model would suggest that the job losses associated with a 2-year spending cap would be much smaller, about maybe $250,000. But most of that effect will be felt in 2024, especially close to the presidential election in November. Wow. So I think that in terms of the timing of a 2-year spending cap, it would be still unfavorable to the presidential election, to the incumbent. However, whoever who wins the White House in November 2024 will see a rebound in economic growth in 2026 or towards 2025 as these caps are removed.
All right, Anna Wong, great analysis from Bloomberg Economics. Thank you so much for joining us. And Joe, as Anna talks about the favorability when it comes to election politics, there's also the question of how favorable it may be for the Federal Reserve, which in theory wants to see some job losses showing up, or at least a loosening of the labor market. So this bill does the Fed's job for it if they actually got it through the Senate? That's an interesting thought. But to consider the way this would land in a presidential election cycle is really important as we consider the contours of this debate. Coming up, Hungary's leader vetoing more Ukrainian aid, saying he believes the country's military effort is doomed. We'll talk to former Secretary of Defense William Cohen next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
Now, keeping you up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. Donald Trump's New York criminal case will go to trial on March 25th of next year. The judge made the decision after a hearing today on an order barring the former president from posting evidence on social media. Trump is charged with falsifying business records in connection with hush money payments to an adult film star made just ahead of the 2016 presidential election. He has pleaded not guilty. Apple is clashing with the European Union over a $14 billion tax deal. The iPhone maker and Ireland are hitting back at the EU's antitrust watchdog. They say regulators made legal errors when they concluded Apple was given vast amounts of unfair tax aid and issued to order to repay the money. Yelp shares surged today following a Wall Street Journal report that an activist investor has called for the company to look into a sale or other strategic options. TCS Capital Management plans to deliver a letter to Yelp's board to make the case for a sale, arguing that the firm could fetch more than double its current share price. And Netflix is cracking down on account sharing in the U.S. The streaming service today outlined procedures and costs for customers who wish to continue sharing their accounts with people outside their household. Netflix is giving them the option to share their account for an additional $8 a month. The crackdown on password sharing is a key part of Netflix's strategy to generate more revenue from users. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Originals. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Kayleigh Lyons and Joe Matthew here in Washington, D.C., where the debt ceiling conversation, Joe, obviously is looming large, but we aren't just paying attention to it here. This is global. The eyes of the world really are on the U.S. as the drama and dysfunction, if you will, plays out very publicly.
Absolutely. We've been waiting to hear from corporate America. When's the letter with 50 CEOs on it? We kind of got that in verbal form today, I suppose, didn't we?
Yeah, Bloomberg spoke with a number of guests at the Qatar Economic Forum talking about this issue, and they all sounded pretty consistent on this idea that the U.S. isn't actually going to default on its debt. Take a listen.
I think both sides knows there needs to be a bipartisan deal. It will be a compromise. And I think we'll get the debt ceiling raised.
No deal gets done until everybody walks away from the table at least once. And so we're doing that in a global environment with a lot of media. But I do think sooner or later the debt ceiling will be yesterday's news.
Of course, we're worried about the debt ceiling, but I heard the reassuring comments both from President Biden and Speaker McCarthy yesterday. I have to think these guys know what they're playing with, so I'm okay on that.
My hope is, like the other 4 times that we were in this situation in my lifetime, that we actually stop playing games. If we are doing that, I'm not saying that we are, but I do believe that there's a solution in here, and the longer we take to get to it, the worse it's going to be.
So it seems, Joe, that at least on Wall Street, and you arguably are seeing this reflected in financial markets as well, that there is this prevailing narrative that the deal always gets done. We're going to get there. It's just a matter of time. And you even did hear from Speaker McCarthy earlier today saying that we could still get this done by June 1st. Absolutely. I just wonder how much that optimism, this idea that it's a foregone conclusion that the U.S. isn't going to default is matched by the reality of what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. And this is playing out, of course, in the equity markets where we've seen, very little reaction, at least in comparison to what we saw in 2011. You remember that was a peak to trough decline of roughly 20%. This time, everyone thinks they know better, right? But then again, this is the same market betting on Fed rate cuts this year, even as the Fed says that's not going to happen. In this case, there is a belief that they will find a deal. Whether or not that's a dangerous assumption, we'll find out.
Yeah, and I have to wonder how much the lack of real market reaction other than specific parts of the Treasury market is contributing to this narrative now that June 1st really isn't the hard deadline that needs to be paid attention to, that maybe there is a little bit more fungibility here when it comes to what Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has been laying out. That is something we have heard from multiple lawmakers today, really over the course of the week. And the idea that the market's not reacting at this point may support that argument. Yeah, that's also true. There seems to be a thought that there's more flexibility here than the Secretary has been letting on. Of course, we have to remind everybody of the 3 most important words. As soon as. Right. That has been in every letter. As soon as June 1st. Nobody said it was actually going to be on that day. Goldman Sachs said it's the 8th or the 9th. I believe Morgan Stanley says it's the 8th. So we're in that time frame. The question, though, is whether Janet Yellen's thumbing the scale. And that seems to be the suggestion by some Republican lawmakers. And we have no reason to believe that that's the case. Yeah, and we spoke with a former Treasury spokesman, John Rizzo, earlier on Sound On Radio, who said this really is it. This is what the Treasury is laying out.
There are career bureaucrats crunching these numbers. It's not Janet Yellen with a magic box at home, I think was the idea. I paraphrase a little. Coming up, talks over the debt ceiling, continuing here with the House Speaker telling Republicans there is still some distance to go. We're going to break it down next with our political panel on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. House Speaker McCarthy says a debt deal remains elusive as negotiations continue. For more, we assemble our political panel. Lauren Tomlinson at Steer PR is with us, along with Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. It's great to see both of you. Lauren, I'm curious to take your temperature on this right now, because we're hearing new levels of bluster every day. Now, House Republicans are questioning the X date. On the other hand, we're hearing that there are actually some areas where they're coming together. Garrett Graves says there are some areas where we really see eye to eye. We just need to figure out the rest. Do you have a sense, we're kind of asking everybody this, where things stand right now? If you can clear out the clutter, what do you see?
I see a bunch of people who are actually very committed to getting this done by the X date. And whether that's a few days here or there, I think both sides are really actually very committed, because I think the polling that you've seen come out today states pretty clearly where the American people are, that they would blame both sides pretty equally if this does not get done. And so I think that you see a lot of, I think you're going to see a little bit more blinking by the White House over the next couple of days. I think, the McCarthy has said multiple times that maybe the Senate should just take up the bill that they've passed and then start the negotiating process there and just kind of bypass where the White House is at this point. So I think that they're going to start really getting down to the numbers, really start to get down to some of the process. I don't believe that Republicans actually believe that the X date is not the X date. I don't think that they're going to want to gamble that close to anything. Right. McCarthy has said pretty clearly that he thinks that we need something done by the end of this week in order to go through the legislative process and get something cleared by June 1st. So I really think that you've got responsible actors here who, and I think the markets are reflecting that, right? Like, people are kind of waiting to see how this process goes out. And we've seen time again, Congress continues to go to the very end, and then they hold those 3 a.m. votes and get it done at the last minute, right? Unfortunately, I think we might be in that situation again where they're going to wait until the very last minute and then get it done. But again, I really do think there's a bipartisan consensus here that nobody wins, and they're going to have to pull something together.
Yeah, and the nobody wins question, as you just said, the White House may be the one that has to blame. Kristen, I do wonder how you view the administration's playing of this, insisting for so long, we aren't going to negotiate, we are only going to accept a clean raise of the debt ceiling. Now, sitting around the negotiating table, essentially trying to hammer this out. Mm-hmm. Where's the leverage?
So we knew this was going to happen, and we have to remember that the White House was essentially waiting until McCarthy put his own bill on the floor, because only then could they decide or figure out exactly what he could pass, with just his conference. And now it's really a numbers game, right? I mean, not just the numbers that they have to work out in detail for what's going to actually be included in any sort of agreement, but how many votes does, Leader Jeffries have to bring to the table? Because I would be shocked if, there weren't Democratic votes needed for this. So that's a whole nother dynamic. And you can see where, the language coming out of the White House and coming out of the Speaker McCarthy's office has shifted a little bit, being a little bit more positive about each other, which is significant. And I think you're right. I think, unfortunately, it's a manufactured crisis. But people will blame both sides. It will certainly blame the president during the re-election. They'll blame McCarthy now.
If there were a default.
Yes.
Or getting too close, I guess. An interesting conversation I had earlier, we were talking about with Congressman Jim McGovern, a progressive Democrat whose main issue is hunger. And he says if they put additional work requirements in this bill, he's a no vote, and he's taking the rest of the progressive caucus with him. So how much of a problem is this if Hakeem Jeffries needs to be counting Democratic votes?
I mean, I think it's a problem with the Progressive Caucus. It's a problem with the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus. You have some major problems there. And the White House doesn't, that's been one of the biggest sticking points. So, I think that's probably what they're stuck on right now. And how do you cobble together those votes? But even if you can get enough of the more center-left votes on the Democratic side to make up the difference, does the president want to go there and set that, set that standard?
Well, there's also a question if Speaker McCarthy is still Speaker McCarthy at the end of all of that. There is still a real question of his future should enough Republicans not like ultimately the deal that he is able to negotiate with the president. We actually had Bloomberg reporting today suggesting that some moderate Democrats are going to be willing to step in and protect him should that scenario arise. Do you think that might actually be necessary?
No, I think that everyone has been actually shocked at how well the Republicans have stayed in line and have followed McCarthy's lead. I mean, I have. I thought it was going to be way more chaotic. I think the White House thought it was going to be way more chaotic. Wow. But he has pretty much kept everybody in line as they've gone through this negotiating process, and that is no small feat. So I think that the fact that he has maintained support all the way up until this point, and his caucus has allowed him to go through this negotiation process is actually a good sign for that. And, we'll see what happens when they bring it to the floor, and you may have some votes peel off. But, if we're doing the bean counting, they're going to have to pull in the moderate Democrats anyways. And I think everybody recognizes this, that, you basically are going to have to do the whip count of we're going to lose these guys. Politically, they're going to have to vote no. We may lose some progressives. Who can we pull on, from both sides to cobble together something? It's not going to be an ideal deal for anybody. But again, I think everybody knows that they're going to lose big if they don't get this done.
Yeah.
Right. And they're working against the clock because we keep coming back to this idea, Joe, that it's one thing to hammer out a deal. It's another thing to go through the process, the days-long process to actually get it passed by both chambers.
That's why we're wasting a lot of time potentially on the extreme wings of both parties when it's the center that will be needed to pass this thing. But we'll see how that ends up.
Indeed, we will. Now, coming up, our panel is going to be sticking with us as we turn to another topic. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis set to launch his 2024 presidential run in a Twitter Spaces live stream with none other than Elon Musk. We'll have more on that next with the political panel, plus a conversation with former Defense Secretary William Cohen coming up. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
We'll be interviewing Ron DeSantis, and he has quite an announcement to make. And will be the first time that something like this is happening on social media, and with real-time questions and answers, not scripted. So it's going to be live, and let her up. Let's see what happens.
Yep, that was him. That was Elon Musk at the Wall Street Journal CEO Council Summit earlier today, talking about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announcing his 2024 run on the platform that he owns come tomorrow evening. For more, let's bring in our political panel once again. Lauren Tomlinson, Steer PR partner, and Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. So, Lauren, we're talking about a Republican candidate who is going to announce his candidacy formally with one of the world's richest men who has said he's not going to be endorsing anyone in this race. I have to say, as a member of the media, we are attracted to certain individuals. We talk about them a lot. Donald Trump is one who is kind of a media magnet. Frankly, Elon Musk is another. And I have to wonder if that's what this is an attempt at, is kind of capitalizing on that star power, if you will.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I definitely think there's a thought in DeSantis's head, maybe I can get Elon Musk's 140 million Twitter followers to pay attention to this if I do it. But I mean, for me, the question is, how are they going to capture this interview and then push it around to the audiences that are going to matter more for a presidential primary, right? We're not talking about our core Republican primary voters hanging out on Twitter Spaces all day. Right. I mean, I would guess that a lot of them don't even know what it is. So how are they actually announcing to the voters that are going to be going out in New Hampshire, in Iowa, in South Carolina, these early states that are going to be determining if DeSantis makes it through all the way until, the actual general election. So I'm a little skeptical on this announcement strategy by them. I know they're going to be releasing a more traditional video afterwards, the following day, but maybe there's something there that I don't know, but it seems like a strange way to come out, especially since he's been teasing this announcement for so long, and it seems like a strange way to maximize the exposure that you're getting.
Especially when, most people, we know there's going to be an in-person announcement next week, there's going to be a baseball field or something. Most people aren't walking around knowing that. They figure this is the announcement. So, Kristen, is this delicious for you as a Democrat, or is this a concern?
I mean, it's confusing, honestly. I mean, I'll say, as somebody who's run campaigns, I'm looking at it and going, honestly, one of my first thoughts was, is he afraid that if he does an event like we saw in South Carolina, announcement event, that he's going to, Donald Trump has been fixated on him. So maybe this is his way of, getting into the field and doing it in a way where he can control his own narrative.
Does
I
it
think it's very
remind Donald
strange.
Trump that he's not the richest man in the world? Is that part of this as well?
I mean, maybe. Who knows? I mean, with that field. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I think that there's a lot that Ron DeSantis does that we're going to be able to capitalize on as Democrats.
I will say, too, it's interesting. Usually this time of year, you have a lot of events and rallies that are going on in Iowa, especially. Yeah. And the people on the ground in Iowa are saying that they're not seeing that. There's a bigger focus on the campaigns on very small events. So I'm curious this election cycle if everyone is a little scared of the Donald Trump effect. Like if you don't bring the huge crowds, is it already a disappointment because the expectations are set too high in the media and otherwise? So I could see this being a play towards that. Like let's stay away from large rally style like crowd sizes so we don't have the comparison of Trump of how many people showed up, how many people didn't, and build momentum in a smaller, like more contained way. But I think that's like an interesting 2024 dynamic that we're going to see play out throughout the year.
Yet another soft lunch on the campaign trail.
So popular these
Many
days.
thanks to our panel. Lauren, great to have you. Kristen, great to have you with us once again on Bloomberg. Elsewhere, the war in Ukraine back in the spotlight here. As fighting near the Russian border intensifies, this as Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban votes to block more aid to Ukraine, telling Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite that it would only lead to more deaths.
My position is that looking at the reality, looking at the figures, looking at the surroundings, looking at the fact that NATO is not ready to send troops, it's obvious that there is no victory for poor Ukrainians on the battlefield.
Victory for Putin on the battlefield. Joining us now by phone is the former Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, now the founder and chair of the Cohen Group. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being with us. Why is Mr. Orban wrong?
Well, I think he's wrong, first of all, in not condemning President Putin for invading a neutral and sovereign country. The fact that he believes that Putin will ultimately win really kind of misses the point that Putin has violated international law. He's been charged with being a war criminal. And yet he is on the side, apparently, of President Putin and saying if we suspend all aid to Ukraine, then obviously more people will not die. It doesn't deal with the issue of how many tens and hundreds of thousands of people have died at the hands of Vladimir Putin, who broke his word that Ukraine would be a sovereign country and has killed tens of thousands and sent millions into foreign countries as refugees and displaced millions internally. So I can't say that he is acting much like a true member of NATO as a democratic country with democratic values.
But in his reference to NATO, he talked about the reluctance, the unwillingness to put boots on the ground. And we've seen reluctance to provide certain weapons for Ukraine. It took a very long time, Mr. Secretary, for the U.S. to give in on the issue of F-16s. Is there more that the allies should be doing as Ukraine prepares this counteroffensive?
I think we absolutely should. And the fact is, I've been quite critical that we haven't been more aggressive in providing training for Ukrainian pilots on F-16s. That we hesitated in terms of whether we're going to provide advanced tanks, et cetera. The Ukrainian forces have been heroic, and they have demonstrated in a very short period of time they can master the mechanics and the ability to maneuver and to perform with the sophisticated equipment. So I think we have to do more. We've always been afraid that Putin would escalate. He has been escalating. Everything he has done, from invading, saying, gee, I won't target civilian people or institutions or schools or hospitals, he's done everything in violation of that. And so the notion that somehow we have to cease right now with everything in place, it seems to me that's a victory for Putin. He doesn't deserve a victory. He deserves to have his forces defeated on the ground in Ukraine, a sovereign country.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Cohen, I have to ask you, we only have a moment left, but I want to hear from you on this nuclear power plant in Ukraine, occupied by Russia. This is the one in Zaporizhia that we've been talking about now. It's been taken offline, off the power grid 7 times. And there are great concerns that the generators are not going to be able to continue backing up this plant. What can the U.S. do to help Ukraine avoid a meltdown?
doing as much as we can by calling the world's attention to what the Russians are up to. They've been placing this nuclear facility at risk for over a year now. Putin has said he would use nuclear weapons, tactical, but this would be a devastating explosion if it should take place, and spreading radioactive debris all over Ukraine, to be sure, but even parts of Russia and elsewhere. So I think he has not really been called on the carpet, so to speak, by enough of the international community. The Chinese have said very little. India has said very little. The countries in the Middle East have said very little. I think the world has to come down very hard and say, you should not put this at risk, and you will bear the consequences of this from a global perspective if you do.
Yeah. Our thanks to the former Secretary of Defense, William Cohen. Be sure to check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. Kaylee, there's a lot to cover there.
Yeah, there is, including continued coverage of the debt ceiling negotiations ongoing here in Washington, though unclear when the next meeting will be. We'll keep you up to date. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.